From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana.
So my kids are at an age where everything has to be quite particular. So I sometimes make a meal which sounds horrific to, well, probably anyone, but it's very quick and easy. So potato waffles out of the freezer into the toaster, baked beans into the microwave, and pre-grated cheddar cheese, something I would never have used before becoming a parent, but which is a lifesaver. So you basically make a meal in about 2 minutes. And my youngest son always used to like them cut into quarters, cheese on the top, and then one day it all changed. So I brought the waffles and he looked at them and just went into meltdown. And this is a proper tantrum. I'm talking tears, snot streaming down his face, head back, wailing like it was the end of days. I'm like, what's the matter? He says, Daddy, you've done it all wrong. The cheese should be on the side and you shouldn't have cut them up. And this was just an utter disaster over some potato waffles.
Now, if you're a parent, or if you've spent any amount of time with a toddler, some of that will probably sound eerily familiar.
So what did I do? Did I tell him to eat up or go to bed hungry? Or did I shout back? Or did I eat the waffles myself? I just made some new waffles. I said, fine, you'll win this one. You've got to pick your battles. And that really got me thinking about what was going on in my brain.
Why is it that in this situation, you don't react differently to Wafflegate? Instead of shouting in return, you somehow carry on with previously unimaginable levels of zen. To an onlooker, the whole situation might look baffling, but according to scientists, there's something much bigger going on. The story today: how men's brains change when they become dads.
I'm Ben Spencer. I'm science editor of the Sunday Times.
Ben, we're about to talk about the parenting brain, the science of what happens when you become a dad. But I should just say that today, as we speak, you're actually living it.
I am. As all working parents know, it's not always smooth. So my younger son is off sick today. So I'm doing this while looking after him. And he is plonked in front of the telly, which is a vital tool for all parents. So yeah, that's today's task.
Thank God for that. Ben, you were commissioned by your editor to write about the changes that happen to women, to women's brains when they become mothers. What made you look at fathers too?
So last September, this study came out from America showing these very interesting scans on the brain of one mother throughout her pregnancy. And it was kind of the most detailed insight into what happens in a woman's brain as she becomes a mother that we'd ever seen. So the deputy editor of the Sunday Times, Chrissy Morrison, herself a mother, said, can you look into this and can you write a feature about what happens to mothers' brains? And I said, that's fine. That's really interesting. But what people haven't really written about is what happens to dads' brains. Because a lot of these changes happen to dads as well. And the science is just emerging on this. So we had a compromise, and I basically written about both men, women, adoptive parents, surrogate parents, gay parents, all of us. What's actually happening to our brains and what that tells us about ourselves.
So what is happening? What sort of changes are taking place?
So researchers scanned the brain of one woman as she went through pregnancy. She was having an IVF baby, so they started off by scanning her before she conceived. And then they scanned her every few months, right through her pregnancy, and then into the first few months of parenthood. And what they found was her brain completely changed, and it touched every part of her brain. It was really dramatic, actually. So the grey matter, which is the kind of grey, wrinkly layer that covers the brain and is responsible for things like memory and learning, that actually shrinks. And that's fascinating because that doesn't sound like a good thing, brain shrinkage. But actually, neurologists think that this is fine-tuning the brain. So you're getting rid of those bits of the brain that you don't need and becoming very specialized. And what's interesting is there's other studies have just been done very recently with new dads in Barcelona and in Los Angeles, where they tracked about 40 dads from their partner's pregnancy till very early stages of having a newborn. And they also showed this grey matter shrinkage, which is fascinating, but only if they were hands-on and only if they intended to be hands-on. So there seems to be something to do with intentionality here.
And that's something you've actually experienced. Just tell us how that felt. At what point after the birth of your first child did you feel like something had changed? Something in your brain, something in the way that you function was now different?
With my first son, I've got a 7-year-old and a 4-year-old. It was a very traumatic birth for my wife. It was an emergency C-section. And that meant that my wife wasn't able to look after our son immediately. She was recovering from surgery, and our son had suspected sepsis, so he was in an intensive care unit on a different floor of the hospital. So it was me who was sat next to him over the crib for those first few hours, that first night. So it's that responsibility of being the primary carer that was me immediately. I changed the first nappy, did it badly. We went everywhere. The alarms kept going off. I kept pulling out the wires, and all those caring instincts kick in. Scientists tell us your oxytocin, which is the kind of caring hormone, goes up. Testosterone, which is the thing that gives men aggression and competitiveness, goes down. So you're not competing with this tiny human, and your brain starts to change.
Can you feel that change? I mean, are you aware that your brain is starting to act differently?
So your whole perception of threat changes when you become a parent. And I mean, I can't speak for all parents, but I can speak for myself. You see threats everywhere. So if you're crossing a road, you can become hyper aware of all the traffic around you. If you're in a playground, you become hyper aware of the bigger kids. When your children are a bit older and they're knocking glasses over, I still reckon I could catch a glass off a table from 10 yards, because my threat perception is hyper specialized. So in those early days, particularly for us with a child in hospital initially, we became very sensitive to what temperature our son was. And we brought him home in the middle of a heat wave. And the first thing I did was put on the central heating because I was worried about him getting cold.
Hyperprotective, it turns out. But that increased sense of threat perception, what's actually happening in your brain?
So there's a part of the brain called the amygdala, which controls your sensory perception, all the sights, sounds, tastes, smells coming into your brain. And what scientists have found is that amongst mums in particular, the amygdala becomes very sensitive. And it's one of the reasons that new parents, they might usually sleep through an alarm clock, but if their baby's crying, they will wake up. And it's why you perceive threats differently.
As you began to explain earlier, researchers are now seeing that these changes aren't just happening to women, they are happening to men, but not to all of them.
With mothers, they have this kind of head start. Their bodies change and they have this surge of hormones that's required for pregnancy, for labor, and if they breastfeed, for feeding their child. What's interesting is that primary carers, so in a traditional family, a conventional family, that would be the mother, the primary carer, the person with responsibility, their amygdala becomes up to 4 times more sensitive than beforehand. And it changes a bit for dads, but not to the same extent. But where parents are equal, you actually see the same change. So if you, as a dad, think it's not your job to change the nappies, you're probably not going to see those hormonal neurological changes. There's been really interesting experiments done with gay fathers. There was a study done in Israel where a researcher scanned the brains of a load of couples with new babies, and half of them were heterosexual, this primary carer being the mother, and the secondary helper dad, and then also these gay male parents where it was more of an equal split. And the gay dads actually saw the same change in their amygdala as the primary carer mums. The secondary carers, the dads, had less of a change. So to me, that tells you that if you're the one taking responsibility, you are the first line of defense. Your brain changes. If you know that your wife or your husband sleeping next to you is the one who's going to get up in the night, you're not going to wake up. This is nothing to do with gender per se. This is about social roles.
Ben, we've been talking about the parent brain and how it doesn't just affect mothers, it does affect fathers too. And it seems they're also susceptible to what we'd call the baby blues. Tell me about that, because I know you experienced it.
Yeah, so, I mean, parenting's hard, right? So, especially at the beginning, it's scary and it's isolating and your life has completely changed. And about 1 in 10 mothers get postnatal depressions, about 8 in 10 suffer low mood, or what people call the baby blues. And what we're increasingly finding is that is also the same for dads. But what's interesting is that in the study where they scanned the brains of dads, is that it was the dads who were most hands-on and the dads who saw the biggest changes in their brains who suffered the more depression early on. It's almost a cost of parenting. Now, again, it's really hard to differentiate what's happening. Is this because hands-on dads are suffering more sleep deprivation, are more isolated from their friends and colleagues, are finding it harder just because parenting is hard? Or is it because the changes in the brain are having an impact on mental health? One theory is that new dads have a big drop in testosterone. That is what is linked to low mood. Now, this is contested because the role of testosterone in mental health is not widely established. But in theory, it could be one of the things that leads to low mood, specifically amongst new dads who are very hands-on.
And Ben, it's not just fathers who are taking an active role when a baby is born who are experiencing these changes. You mentioned earlier that even grandparents are showing signs.
So this can be for anyone. It can be grandparents, step-parents, adoptive parents, aunts, uncles. There's a kind of renowned primatologist and anthropologist called Sarah Blaffer Hardy in the US, who I spoke to for this piece. And she's written many books over the years about motherhood, but she wrote a book about fatherhood when she became a grandparent because she saw her son-in-law caring for her grandson and was just like blown away by what a hands-on dad looks like. And she did this amazing experiment amongst her own family. So when her grandson was born, as she arrived at her daughter's house, she took a saliva sample from herself. She spat into a tube and put it into her daughter's freezer.
This is incredible.
And then cuddled the baby for a couple of hours and then took another sample and got a colleague to test it. And she saw her oxytocin rise 63%. And interestingly, about a week later, her husband arrived, so the child's grandfather, and before he was even in the door, made him spit into a tube and took his oxytocin. And what she saw with him is that after the first day, there was a small bump in oxytocin, but nothing dramatic. But the next day, he cuddled the baby again and saw exactly the same rise, coincidentally, 63% rise in oxytocin. So even in grandparents, you see these changes.
And for the people whose brains are undergoing changes, more than the rise in oxytocin, everything else you've mentioned, the changes to the amygdala, the changes to the grey matter, what sort of impact do those changes have on daily life, outside of the home and outside of caring for the baby?
Well, again, it's very hard to separate. I remember when my first son was born, I think I must have had a month off, and I remember going back to work, and my oldest son's 7.5 now, so that dates it. But it was still in the days where we had landlines on our desks, telephones on our desks,
That
and
dates it.
Yeah, exactly, and voicemails. So I went back into the office and listened to all my voicemails, and I remember halfway through listening to these answer phone messages, the phone rang, and I picked up the phone, and it was a reader asking about something. And in my head, I was still listening to the answer phone. So they were asked a question, and I just didn't answer because I still thought I was listening to the voicemail. And my brain was just scrambled, right? So why is that? Is it because I hadn't had any sleep for a month? Is it because I was still in the world of, sterilizing bottles and working out why my son wasn't feeding properly? Or was it the loss of grey matter? Who knows? Who knows? But I think it's something that in modern society where everyone is juggling a lot more, both men and women, it's probably more pronounced than it has been possibly at any point in human history.
And it's not just in the workplace that you sort of feel these changes. I mean, it does also place a strain on relationships.
Yeah, and a lot of relationships fail when children are very young.
What's going on there? What is it that's contributing to the changes? Is it lack of sleep? Is it what's happening to the amygdala?
Yeah, so sleep is really interesting because sleep deprivation is not minor, and it's something that all parents deal with, and some people deal with it better than others. But all those changes that happen in the brain when you become a parent, that all has an impact on the way we deal with each other. So if you're in a partnership, relationship, bringing up this small child, the way you perceive each other's actions, the way you communicate also changes. So your amygdala becomes highly attuned to a baby's cry, but it also changes the way you perceive others' actions. So in the middle of the night when you're snapping at each other, places a strain, and you might not become so good at that when you're sleep deprived, when your sensory perception is essentially warped by the demands of parenthood. And part of that's neurological, part of it's just the strains of the changes that you're undergoing, financial pressures, sleep deprivation, emotion, going back to work, the isolation of being the one left at home when your partner's not at home. And I mean, all of this is just an argument for better and better shared parental leave, so that it's not just a woman's thing to be left at home looking after the baby. And we've got a part of the way there in that fathers now have the right to take time off. But we're not all of the way there because the economics of it still don't add up.
Ben, from what you've said, lots of people listening to this will sort of think, God, the way your brain changes, there are lots of things to worry about when you have a child, including, it turns out, what's happening inside your brain. But it's not all bad, is it? I mean, I understand that actually having multiple children might be better for your brain. Tell us about that.
Yeah, there's a fascinating study which was done on the UK Biobank, which is this huge resource of biomedical data, including brain scans. A couple of years ago, some scientists looked at 30,000 brains of parents and non-parents, and they found that people who'd had 2 or more children actually had younger brain ages later on, and were better at recall tests and functional tests. Their reaction times were quicker. And this is hugely encouraging for parents, and you might not believe it, but apparently being a parent is actually good for your brain.
It's not all bad. Ben, for you, wading through all of this research, synthesizing it for your piece, did it help you make sense of your own experience as a parent?
Yeah, it did. It was actually really helpful. So my sons are 4 and 7, and when they're at that age where they're tantruming and they're trying to establish independence and they're really pushing back at every opportunity they can, and there's quite a lot of conflict, at least in my house, then how you cope with that, I think, is really interesting. So natural reaction when someone's shouting at you is a fight or flight response, right? You shout back. When a child's having a tantrum, if you've undergone these changes, if you have a parent's brain, you don't shout back, at least not every day, ideally, although it doesn't always work. So I think a parent's brain at its best is kind of a superpower. And on the bad days, on the hard days, and there are lots of them, it just helps you survive. It helps you get through the day to day, helps you get through the weeks and thrive and help mold these children into functioning members of the human race without losing your mind.
That was the Sunday Times science editor, Ben Spencer. He's written about this in the paper and also about how modern parenting advice could be fueling an allergy epidemic in children. Do have a look. You can find all of his articles online at thetimes.com. And if you're a parent, you might also want to have a look at our new Parenting Hub, with a huge range of articles from experts and people with years of hands-on experience. They cover everything from finding the right secondary school, juggling childcare, and deciding when to give your child a smartphone. You can find all of that online at thetimes.com/parenting. The producer today was Emily Webb. The executive producer was Kate Ford, and sound design and theme composition were by Malasetto. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. And if you can, forward it on to anybody who you think should probably hear it, whether they're beleaguered parents or grandparents or just harassed friends. Hopefully, it might come in handy. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.